G'day, welcome to the Financial Bloke Podcast, the podcast for people seeking the wisdom needed to grow their family's wealth and live a happier, healthier and more prosperous life. My name's Ben Law and I am the Financial Bloke. G'day everyone, welcome back to the podcast. Today we're going to be discussing family relationships for people on the land. Now, you might be thinking, why the hell are we talking about relationships on a podcast which is about wealth and wisdom? Well, relationship breakdowns is a major contributor to families' loss of wealth and also unhappiness, and it's a huge reason why the old saying goes, it takes 2 generations to build it and 1 to lose it. Today's guest is Flynn. Ali's got over 20 years experience as a therapist, facilitator and mindset coach, helping leaders to improve the mindset and performance of their teams so they can thrive as individuals and overall improve companies' performance. Communication is a big issue for those on the land, and I can't wait to get cracking on this episode. So without further delay, welcome Ali.
Hi Ben, thank you so much for having me.
Ali, where I'd like to start with is, can you just give us a bit of a summary on your background and why it is you know what you're talking about on this topic?
A lot of relationship breakdowns. No, my background, I did an undergrad in psychology at the University of New England here, and then travelled Australia for a couple of years, had a bit of a break after uni, and then came back and started working as a clinical therapist. I did a postgrad in emotionally focused therapy, and I worked with kids and adolescents that were homeless or at risk of homelessness. Did a lot of work. I did some in jails, some on the streets. I did some couple therapy. And then when I had 3 little baby girls, I stepped away from the industry because a lot of my work was in sexual assault and domestic violence. And having 3 little children, it just kind of wasn't the stage for me to be doing that work, because you've got to be really committed to the any of the clients that you're working with. It's long-term therapy. And then I started a fitness business. So totally moved away from the industry, grew 3 companies from there, a fitness business, a coaching business, and a yoga studio. And now I also have an international podcast, Challenges That Change Us, which is going gangbusters. We're nearly at our 1st year anniversary.
Wow, yeah, and I've been a guest on there, and it was a fun experience to have. Ali and I could have talked for days.
I know. It was so good to have you on, and it was around a topic, everyone will have to go and have a listen. It was around a topic that isn't spoken about, and that's one of the reasons why I love podcasting is we can have these conversations and people can pick and choose which conversation they listen to at which point in time and what's relevant for them.
So Ali, with you being a communication relationship expert, I suppose would be the right way to put it. You mightn't call yourself that,
no.
But I'd say you've got a lot more expertise than me. But with people on the land, why do relationships start to degrade over time?
That is a great question. And if we could solve that in 45 minutes, I think that I would be a billionaire. The reason why they degrade is really complicated. I was thinking about it before I came on today around some of the challenges that people have to navigate. And it's different for everyone. So everyone comes into a relationship with history. So they have their childhood, they have different core beliefs, they have different priorities at where they're at in that point in time. They have different opinions. Everything about that person will be different from the person next to them, and they're trying to meet in the middle. And then you add 2 or 3 or 4 people to that relationship like you do when you're on a family farm, and you've got a whole bag of goodies, but often there hasn't been a conversation about it at the very beginning or the foundational blocks put in place. So what can happen over time is if we miss that very first step of foundational blocks of having the conversation and getting on the same page, is these little kind of cracks start to appear. And then you add a bit of adversity or add a few challenges or add drought and, a sibling getting married or bringing in 3 partners to the relationships or that cohort, then those cracks can start to get bigger. And the less that they're addressed, the bigger they become, until there's a point of time where there's a complete breakdown, or there's silos being created within the family, or there's wealth loss, like you said, or people just give up. It's too hard. So I just won't bother.
Well, it's interesting, Ali. I read some research that came out of the US a number of years ago, and they were talking about essentially why wealth transfers fail. And so that's the American slang for succession planning. I suppose you'd relate that to the rural space. And there was a number of reasons why it happened, but they attributed 60% of the reason to a breakdown in trust and communication in a family. And so people quite often look to their accountants or their lawyers or their professionals to help them do a succession plan, when if 60% of the reason why they fail is because of communication, my personal advice to most people is get that stuff right, and then you're well and truly on the way. And it's also another reason why quite often accountants and lawyers can't help you. Now, Ali, what I'd like to do is I'd like to give us, because we like to be really practical here and give people ways of dealing with things. So I'd love to give you a scenario which I see happen. Yeah, this is the most common example I see is on farm is you'll see, say, mum and dad that are, let's just say they're 55 to 65, somewhere in that bracket. They're getting up close to retirement age. And then you've got adult children, might be one or a couple, coming back onto the farm. That could be a son and his wife. That could be single. It could be a daughter and her husband, etc., or many other variants. But you've got the younger generation, adult children coming through, mum and dad on the farm, and then relationships have started to sour. Now, for some people, that can be just little niggles. The relationship's just not as good with mum and dad anymore, or with my kids. Things have got a bit strained, which I think is normal through the transition. Or it could go down to it's become toxic. I don't want to necessarily talk about the toxic side of things. I'd rather talk about families that have, just gone down that slippery slope of things not being right. So can we start with, how do we start to improve the communication in families when the relationships have started to degrade?
One of the first places to start in that scenario is to get a lay of the land. It's to take a step back and take a breath and to start asking some really curious questions about the situation. For example, what can I see happening? What is my take on this situation? What am I reacting to here? So before we go into what's happening with the other person, it's like, what am I rubbing up against that's causing friction or fear or aggression? Like, what is happening for me in this scenario? So is it, for example, that I feel like I'm unheard and unseen? Have I come back on the farm and mum and dad are running it a certain way and they're not asking for my opinion, or when I put it forwards, they're not listening to it? Or is it that I'm exhausted, like I've gone from being at uni, perhaps like often these days the kids are going off to uni and then coming back to the farm? Is it that I've come back and I've been living this life where I haven't had to work long hours 7 days a week, and now I've just been dumped in it and I'm working all the time and I forgot to take the break or to fill up my bucket with things that allow me to keep going for long periods of time? So I think it's really important to get to what is happening for me personally before we start to look outwards. And then I think the next thing is to see, well, what is the problem here? Like, once I work out what's happening for me and vibrating for me, what's happening outside of me? So is it that we, as we mentioned earlier, is it that we forgot to have the conversation when I came back to the farm about where are we at? Who's who in the zoo? What kind of hats are we wearing? Am I coming back to work as a manager on the farm? Am I coming back to be in charge or be a shareholder or to be a worker? What's going to happen with my partner when they come back with me? Sometimes when children return to the farm, they return with partners, and we might have the conversation with the person that's the family member, but not have the conversation with their partner. So what happens in that scenario? Is that partner feeling left out, unheard, not validated, unseen? So I think it's really important when you're returning to the farm that you sit down with whoever it is that's there, whether that be one parent, two parents and a sibling, and have the initial conversation. Where are we at? Where do we want to go? What do we know? What's everyone's thoughts about the future? And like when you talk about succession planning, that's where that can come into play there. What's happening? What's the strategic plan here? What's the succession plan here? Who's in charge of operations and what does that look like and what does that mean for me going forwards?
What's my path to success here? Like, what's my path to ownership or to control or to a better position? Or how long is my apprenticeship before I start to be involved in the running of the business?
The decision making. Yeah, and what's everyone else's view on this as well? Because it's really important that everyone's able to come together and have a really healthy, robust conversation about that. And I think sometimes we put so much pressure on ourselves to come up with the answer in the moment. But sometimes that initial conversation is just to get an understanding, just to ask some questions. What have you been thinking? if you don't know, that's okay. How about we revisit this? How about we all go away and have a think about it and come back together in a week or a month and have a conversation specifically about like what roles look like what, or who's in charge here, or you might be talking about what does retirement look like, or what's the exit strategy if this doesn't work out. I think we put so much pressure on ourselves that everyone should be able to come back to the farm, get along, do the work collaboratively, even though we often don't have the discussion about what that collaboration looks like, and retire comfortably.
Today's episode is brought to you by AgriCoach. You've worked bloody hard over the years and you've built a solid operation. But as your children grow up and start their own journeys, you're beginning to think about the next 5, 10, and even 15 years and how to keep driving the business forward and ensure a smooth and successful succession plan. Preparing the business, preparing the next generation, and preparing for your eventual retirement all requires a solid plan and a proven process. Unsure about the right steps to take? Head on over to agricoach.com.au/webinar to learn more about our Succession Proof Your Family webinar. AgriCoach, aligning families, growing wealth, and protecting legacies. And now, let's get back to the episode. Makes perfect sense. Having that conversation. So most people don't have that conversation, Ali, do they? Because, in the farming world, very few families, in my experience, actually sit down and have proper meetings. It usually starts with a bit of a rough conversation over the kitchen table or in the yards or something like that and never gets structured. So that first conversation is really, really important around expectations. What do you want? The new generation coming through, what are you wanting out of this? The older generation, what are you wanting out of this? And let's see where we're at. And I think the mistake a lot of people make is they, as you quite rightly said, is they need to have the answers and the solutions when they have a meeting. One of the things is some meetings need to be outcome-based in the sense that, you come in, you problem solve. Are we going to buy the neighbour's place? Are we going to take on more debt? Are we going to buy that grader? Like, you need to make decisions and move forward. Others are an evolution. And I'm guessing the conversations that family need to have shouldn't necessarily have an outcome right there and then. They should be an evolution that they go through over time. So once, people come back, they start to build up a bad habit of fighting over things, just little niggly stuff. How can, say, the younger generation or even the older generation sit down and open the conversation so that it doesn't fall back into the old habits of just niggling at each other or closing down? Because that's what people naturally do, isn't it? When there's a little bit of conflict, most people either blow up or they shut down. And both of those are as bad as each other.
So we refer to that as you're either annihilated, where you attack outwards. So that's that blow up situation where when you're feeling threatened or vulnerable, you look outwards in the world and attack people or things. Yeah. So, and that happens to protect yourself. It just does a really poor job of it, right? So I always imagine it like arrows come towards you and they hit a shield and bounce back out and go out into the world. So that's annihilated. And then the other part that you spoke about is that retreat, and that's abandoned. That's when the arrows come at you, but there's holes in that shield. So they come straight through and hit you in the heart. And so you retreat and withdraw so you don't get any more stressed, worried, vulnerable. So that's to give a tiny little background on potentially why people do those two things. And everyone sits on that continuum between annihilation and abandonment somewhere. We all sit on it to different degrees, but when we're put under enough stress, we will tend to either attack outwards or retreat to protect ourselves. And when you can understand that, it can make it a lot easier to go in and have a conversation with someone that's in that reaction. So if we think about it, let's just talk about someone that's in the annihilated state, so that attacking outwards. Let's say you're out on the farm, you're doing some fencing, you say something and dad blows up. He gets really reactive. He starts yelling, he starts storming, he starts throwing stuff around. He's in quite an agitated space. What do we do in that scenario? So we can either be like, oh my God, I've done something wrong. This is really bad. Or we'll attack back at him and be like, no, that's your fault. Like, you didn't listen to what I said. Neither of those outcomes serve here. So if you're wanting to get clarity on the situation, to be able to communicate effectively and to be able to help nourish and support that relationship, there's a couple of really cool tricks that we can do in this space. If someone is attacking outwards, and if you think about that verbal diarrhea, that verbal rant, it's like, he said, she said, why didn't this happen? How did you do this? Like, just blur, 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 blur. what I do is move my head to the side and let it go over my shoulders, because that verbal rant isn't necessarily at me. It's the person being upset about something or feeling vulnerable, so they're attacking outwards. So move your head to the side, allow it to go over your shoulders, and give it some time. Sometimes you have to actually allow it 5 or 10 minutes. It might feel like a lifetime, but let them get all of that energy out before you step back into the conversation. Because if you try and interrupt that verbal rant, you're not going to get anywhere. It's like you're standing right in the middle of that arrow being thrown straight at you. So move to the side, let it go past. When you notice them starting to settle or simmer or, dial it down just a little bit, then that's the time that you start the communication. That's when you can say things like, let's look at this a different way, or tell me more about that, or can we just spend 5 minutes having a look at what happened? So let's just say the son comes in and says to dad, can I have some more responsibility? Like, when are you going to allow me to make decisions here? And dad just blows up and says, no, I'm trying to get this done. He might have 100 things going on in his head. He might, not be thinking about that scenario in that moment. And you just get that reaction. So you need to move out of the way, allow that reaction to go past, and then come back in as it starts to die down and have the conversation. But the thing about that is it's all about timing. And often we have the conversation when it's built up, and we kind of just let it pop out of our mouth instead of making a plan about when can we talk about this. So once dad's had that reaction, you might say something like, well, okay, not a good time, but is this something we can table to have a conversation about on Sunday? Or is this something that we can talk about at a later date when you've got more time? Because you've come in with your agenda, and that is, I need answers to when I'm going to get responsibility. Dad has only heard, he could have heard anything from, they don't think I'm doing a good job. How am I going to retire? They're attacking me. I don't have time for this. You don't know because we didn't take time to find out. So in that scenario, I think one of the key things here is move out of the way of the attack, come back in once it starts to die down, set a time or an agenda to have the conversation. If you've seen a big reaction, it may not be the time right now to have that conversation, especially if it's a really big topic or if you're emotionally invested in the topic.
So, but before we duck into the next one, Ali, which is what did you say when people close down, the retreat?
Abandonment.
How do you calm yourself down? Because when you say that to dad, you say, hey, dad, this is what I want, and he blows up. It's key that you'd have to calm yourself down to be able to let that pass by. Is there some little tiny tips and tricks people can get to calm themselves down so they don't blow up back?
Yeah, well, if they blow up back, they're also in an annihilated state. So what they're needing to do potentially is to go and have verbal diarrhea somewhere else. So going home and being able to say to someone, can I just vent for a moment? I just need 10 minutes just to get this off my chest. So the other person knows that there's going to be that verbal diarrhea, and then you can have that conversation, unpack it, debrief it, so that you're in an adult self or you're in a position where you can go in and have a healthy conversation. Because if you're both in that highly agitated state, no one wins in that scenario. I've yet to see someone get a good outcome when people are like that. It's okay to have the reaction. It's okay to get frustrated, overwhelmed, annoyed. We're responsible for our actions in that scenario. And if we need to take a moment, press the pause button, find the gap, have a conversation to the left with someone else so that we can come back into this conversation and make it resourceful, we need to learn that about ourselves. And that's something that we haven't spoken about yet, is that self-awareness piece. What do you need to know about you? Because so often we think it's the other person's behavior, when more often than not, we're reacting to that person's behavior. Something is happening for us, not necessarily that other person. So in that scenario where dad starts to blow up, what's the reaction that the son is having? What's happening for the son in that moment? He needs to be able to be aware enough of that so that he doesn't then add another reaction on top of it.
Yeah, I remember my wife said something to me years ago when we were having, shall we say, a disagreement. And she said to me, Ben, do you want to be happy or right? And I remember I looked at her and I said, I want to be right. And then I thought about it once I'd cooled down. I went, no, I want to be happy. And I was wrong. And I think it's hard. Like, you've got to try and think, what's the outcome that you're actually after here? And most of the time when these things blow up, it's because it's just an inappropriate time. When you've got the cattle in the yards, you've got the dog running around doing the wrong thing, you've got pressure to get the cattle loaded or plant the crop or whatever it might be, you're under intense pressure. And then all of a sudden someone says, hey, when am I going to get a bit more responsibility, Dad? And it's just bad timing.
Bad timing or sensitive topic. If you're talking about finances, for example, there's a whole lot of baggage that comes with finances. And we can go into that conversation after we talk about abandonment. But finances is a really good example of where we see challenging conversations, difficult conversations, and where we see high reactions happening.
So let's go on to the abandonment now, because I probably see that more than the aggressive one, because what happens is it's essentially with dads mostly. I know I'm generalizing, so don't shoot me, but you see dads, they don't have the answers. They've spent all their lives having the answers, and then someone comes in and asks them a question they don't know, they just retreat back into themselves and don't want to talk about it. How do we deal with that, Ali?
So there could be a couple of reasons when people retreat. Sometimes it's abandonment, which we're talking about, where instead of attacking outwards against the world, they start to attack inwards and think, what did I do in this situation? It's my fault. I'm to blame. You won't hear that through language. You'll see it through actions. And that's where someone will retreat, go silent, maybe get teary, maybe walk away from the scenario. So instead of having that verbal rant or that physical posture where they stand up and puff out their chest, they will it's almost like they're shrinking or going smaller or removing themselves from the situation. And that's because whatever has been said or whatever has happened in that scenario has gone inwards to them. The arrow has gone through that shield and gone inwards, and they feel vulnerable or hurt. So to protect themselves, they will withdraw from the scenario. What do we do when we notice that someone's doing that? Is if you want to have a win-win in the scenario, if you genuinely want a good relationship and you want to help the other person, then we need to help draw them out in a safe way. And the ways that we do that is by getting curious and asking questions. So when I said you need to know yourself, you also can learn the patterns, the common patterns of relating that you see within your family. So say, for example, let's say we'll do it with a daughter and mum just to compare it, because we just did as father and son. So the daughter's gone to say something to mum and mum's retreat. She's gone back, she's walked into a room, or she's nowhere to be seen, and you kind of can't have that conversation. They've disappeared. So what do you do with that? You will notice over time if this is a common pattern of behavior that you see. And if it is, then you have the conversation with mum and say, hey, mum, what I've noticed is sometimes when I want to go and have the conversation with you, you disappear. Do you need space and time, or can I come after you and ask what's happening for you? And allow that person to tell you what they need in that moment. If they want you to come after them and have the conversation, then you've got permission to go in and say, hey, mum, are you okay? Because you need to help draw them back out of that space. They're retreating. And if you want to be able to have a good conversation, you need to be able to say, hey, something just happened there. Can we talk about it? What happened for you? Now, if someone's in a highly abandoned state, so they've started to really shut down, then it might take them a long time. So it's talking around the situation, and it might take them 5 or 10 minutes or 15 to actually feel like they can say to you, actually, I was feeling like I started to get really worried about what I was going to do in retirement. Or I started to get really worried about what if you fall in love and go overseas, or whatever it is. They may not be able to come up with that straight away. They need to talk in a safe environment to be able to actually say what it is. So if you're someone that's fast-paced, results-driven, likes to get the job done, that can be a very challenging environment for you, because you just want them to tell you exactly what's wrong then and there quickly so that you can deal with it. But actually what they need is warmth, connection, kindness, and patience. The other scenario, though, where that can happen when you spoke about that, where someone retreats, is they just give up. Why bother? I'm not going to get hurt anyway.
I've had this fight 100 times.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's a really important conversation to have too. If someone feels like they're giving up, or you have a sense that the person is giving up, let's say it's siblings in this scenario. So you've got 2 boys and a girl in the relationship. They've all come back to the farm. One brother and sister seem to be on the same page, and the other one just feels like he's not getting anywhere. He's not heard. The others, he might feel like the others are getting more than what he's had. He doesn't understand why the finances are going over there. He doesn't understand why they're getting more responsibility on the farm. And so he just goes, well, why do I bother? Like, no one's going to listen to me anyway. They're the favorite child. Mum and dad aren't going to listen to me. So why should I even bother having the conversation? In that scenario, it can be really helpful to go back to your two things. One is your why. Why are you on the farm in the first place? What is it that drew you back to the farm? What is it that you love about the farm? And just getting connected with your purpose and your why. And the second thing is thinking about what is the common need here. So stepping away from you in that scenario and getting a bird's eye view of it and thinking, what is it that I want and need in this scenario? And then thinking about your siblings and thinking about what do they want and need in this scenario? And then if I was an onlooker, if I was watching this play out in front of me, what can I notice that they both want and need that's similar? So what is that common need? And sometimes what that can do is that switches on our frontal lobe and switches on our empathy so that we can start to see it from another lens. And when we can connect in with, they actually want to feel connected, or they actually want to grow this farm and we all want to grow this farm, or they actually just want to help mum and dad out as they get older. When you can have that common connection piece and that common need, then that can just be that little bridge that you're looking for. You know, when you're starting to see those relationships starting to disintegrate, if you come back to that, it can be that missing piece and that missing link to then move you forwards.
Interesting enough, Ali, I think it's, you know, we talked to the statistics earlier about a lack of communication, and failed communication and a lack of trust was about 60% of the reasons these successions fail. I think it was 15%. It was either 15 or 20% are due to a lack of a clear and defined family mission or purpose. So in other words, what are we all bloody doing this for? Where are we heading towards? And a really strong why. And I think a lot of families don't even talk about that. It's just we do the day-to-day stuff and we just get on with it. So then when you sit down with mum and dad and the kids and you say, okay, well, where are we going? They shrug their shoulders. So you don't have any congruence there. You don't have a family operating together and working towards one goal, because you can have a football team and you all know what the rules of the game are. You know, you've got to get that ball to the other end of the field and score a try and stop the other team doing it. You know the rules of the game. You can fight and scrap amongst yourselves and not really get on well. But when you're on the same team, you know, you can get some team spirit together and win the game. But with family businesses, people don't necessarily know the rules of the game or what the objective is, you know, and they all run around doing their own thing, which causes consternation.
Exactly. And I think we often forget to run it like a business, and that's separate to our personal life. They get so blended as a family on a family farm. And what you're talking about there is, when do we have our business hat on and what are the different aspects of business? So there's operations, there's doing the everyday work on the farm, the cattle work, the sheep work, the shearing, the fencing, the bookkeeping, the operations. There's the strategy, which is what you're just talking about. It's like, where are we? Where are we going? How are we going to know when we get there? What does it look like if we drop the ball? What are the measures we're putting in place around that? When you talk about the vision, but also the values, like, do we all have the same values? Because that's one of the quickest ways that you see people butt up against each other, is when there's a value mismatch. So if someone has a really strong value of fairness and everyone else in the family, it's not relevant to them, or it's not a high value of theirs, they might make decisions not considering fairness in the equation. And the one person that fairness is really high on their value system will start to vibrate and get reactive, because they'll be jumping up and down being like, but that's not fair. Yeah. So that conversation around values is really critical. And that's when you can bring in a strategist, or you can bring in someone like yourself, Ben, where they come in and they work with the family in that space, in that big picture strategy space, succession planning. All of those areas can be really helpful to outsource. You don't have to do this alone. And I think we often try and like muddle our way through it. There's no way in any of my companies I would try and do that on my own. I run strategy days for boards all around Australia, but I would not do my own strategy on my own. I need someone to be holding a mirror up to me and saying, and asking the tough questions, and drawing out of the people that are quiet in the room, and listening to the people that perhaps can't say it the way that they want to say it, and finding a common language, and then having a really succinct one-pager. This is where we are. This is where we're going. This is what's important. And maybe even, like you spoke about, having a decision framework. How are we going to know who's in charge of making these decisions when, and what are kind of the triggers that start this process? So that's like strategy and ops. There's financial. We haven't even touched on financial yet. If money was easy, we'd all be happy, right? It's not easy. Money is one of the hardest conversations to have because for so long, for generations, it has been a taboo topic. You don't sit around the table with your mates and talk about what your income is, how you're spending your money, how you're investing your money, how much debt you have, whether you spent $500 by accident on the weekend, whether that be you bought something for the farm that you weren't meant to, or you went on a shopping spree, or you paid for the kids for something. Like, we just haven't been taught how to have these conversations. At school, if we have money conversations, it's usually more around data. It's like spreadsheets or measurements, but there's so much emotion attached to money.
But it's also risk.
Yeah, I was going to say risk appetite. Like, you've got need to have the question around risk appetite.
Without a doubt. I mean, you've got the older generation. As you get older, you generally become less risk tolerant. You start to become more conservative with the way you view the world. And when you're young, you're usually bulletproof and you're willing to take on the risk. So there's quite often a butting of heads between the younger generation and the older generation with risk. The younger generation has got all the risk tolerance and they haven't seen the negative effects of bad choices, whereas mum and dad have seen all those, interest rates at 20%, severe droughts, cattle prices down, commodity prices, etc. They've seen all that. And so that gets a butting of heads.
Yeah, so absolutely. When you're talking about risk appetite, it's a conversation and using some examples. So if you make a list of some of those things that you just spoke about, and the easiest way could just be put a number on it out of 10. Like, an example of that might be, how much money do we need in the bank to feel secure? So for one person, it might be 10,000. For the next person, it might be 50,000. And for the next person, it might be 500,000. No one's right in that scenario. The right answer is where you come together and meet in the middle. So when we talk about financial risk appetite, it's about having that conversation. How much money are we prepared to say to people, you can go and spend this and it's not an issue. But once we go over this amount, it's an agreed amount, then we need to have a few more eyes over it, or we might need joint signatures, or we might need to have X amount in the bank before we go and buy that. And this is a great conversation for couples, for parents and children, for the farm. This can be transferable across any space. What's your risk appetite in general, and what's your financial appetite?
And having that conversation about it, because if we don't, we get a conflict. So an example of one, Ali, really quickly, just to touch on, was I spoke to a family the other day and there'd been a blow up between a dad and a son. And obviously for confidentiality reasons, I'm not going to give too many details, but essentially they've bought some more properties. They needed to buy some more dog kennels, and it was going to cost $4,000 or $5,000 to build these dog kennels. And Dad said, you need to build them. You need to go do that. And the son saying, look, Dad, we've got so much country to prepare. We've got crops to plant. We're spending an inordinate amount of money on interest every month. We need to be getting into the farming stuff, not building dog boxes. Anyhow, so it turned into a big dust up because Dad said, we can't afford it. Son says, we can't afford to spend the time doing it. And they ended up in a dust up over it, a big dust up. How would you approach that once everyone's heads had cooled down, to be able to bring both parties back to the table and find a resolution? Because I think that's indicative of a lot of scenarios out there.
Yeah, and I think that's when, if you have a communication plan to start off with, there's a space and a time to have those conversations. And it's not about one party being like, oh, I'm so frustrated and angry at this situation. I don't feel like chatting to Dad about that right now because I'm still so mad. But if there's a space and a time that you already have set in stone, that we come together and we talk about things, it's much easier to bring it to the table. So what I mean by that is, you might have a family meeting once a month, which is discussing the operations of the business, the operations of the farm. And everyone comes together and you talk about what's gone well, what hasn't gone well, what do we need to focus on in the next 4 weeks? What resources do we need, or what finances do we need to make that happen? And so in that scenario, that conversation will come up because you come together and it's like, what hasn't gone well? Well, what didn't go well was that conversation we had about the dog kennels, or how we both responded after that conversation about the dog kennels. And then it's like, well, what do we need to do going forwards? Well, we need to have something in place. We need a system and structure to stop that from happening again. Everyone has disagreements. It's not about whether you disagree. It's about how you meet in the middle and how you come back and have the conversation after the event, because you're going to learn from past experiences. And are those conversations tough, difficult, tricky, sticky? Yes, they are, but they get easier over time when you're having them consistently with the same person. And so when a new person comes into the relationship, so you've got 3 sons on the farm, 2 are married, and then the third one gets married and brings a partner into the farm, you need to start at the beginning again. They can't just jump on the page that everyone's on. You need to start to build up that relationship with that person. Each individual family member needs to build that relationship. They need to communicate. They need to work out how they fight. They need to work out how they come together. They need to work out where's the line in the sand and how are we going to measure that and what are we going to do with it when we realize that we're getting very close to that line or we've toppled over the line.
I think that's a perfect set of examples. And look, Ali, I always find with people, it's better to have arguments over the small things and then resolve them. So then when the big things come up, you've got the strategies or the skills or the communication base to be able to do it. I think a lot of us are taught, I know in my family, we were taught not to have conflict. Conflict was unhealthy, but I actually think conflict can be really healthy for a family, and acknowledging that would be an important part of growing, because at the end of the day, families work together and for a long, long time, and there's going to be disagreements, and sometimes they're going to be very important disagreements to have and resolve.
And it's unrealistic to think that there won't be conflict. You know, like there is going to be conflict. There is going to be adversity. There is going to be changes of life situations or stages of life that you have to come back to the drawing board and say, what's changed here? How do we move through this? How do we get through it? And I think when you can remove it from yourself and put it out there on the table and look at it like a problem in those meetings, in those structured meetings, it can just take the person out of the scenario. It's like this with the dog kennels. It's not about your dad or it's not about your son. It's what happened was we both had a very different view on how we were going to spend our money. Let's open that up for discussion and look at ways that this doesn't happen again. So it's not about the individual in that scenario. It's, we just have a different way of looking at it.
Is it fair to say, Ali, that most people waste their time trying to fix everyone else so they operate within their world rather than fixing the way they react to things?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's and that's why I said at the start, it's so important that we look at our own reactions first. And the other thing that we haven't talked about yet is, and this goes to that point, is when I'm going in for a conversation, when there's been, whether it be frustration, anger, shutdown, sadness, whatever it's been, but there's been kind of a reaction and I'm going in to have the conversation with someone, I prep myself, I prep my state. I have a little chat to myself about what tone am I going to bring into this conversation? How am I going to show up in this conversation? What energy am I going to bring? How do I get into state? What does a win-win look like? What does this person need from me so that I can help them navigate it as well? It's like you almost take a coaching role. I think we so often come into the conversation with our own agenda only. But if we just, for a moment, pop our agenda to the side and think about the other person in the scenario and how we can better serve them and help them to be able to communicate with us better, that will help with our agenda when it's ready to bring it back on the table. So, you know, if someone's shut down, like we said, and gone into their room and they're not talking, what can we do to help them in that scenario? And if we're not sure, have the conversation. And it might be later, it might not be in that moment, but be like, when this happens, or I noticed that you went to your room and didn't say anything, what do you need from me then? What could I have done in that scenario to help you in that moment? So we're thinking about the other person, because the value, and for anyone out there that's like, this is all airy-fairy, it doesn't matter. How much is it worth to you to have a good relationship with your family? What's it going to cost you if those relationships start to break down or you start working like solos within that family? It can cost you millions. So relationships are one of those things that aren't tangible, and that's what makes it so hard. Buying a tractor, buying a bull, putting up a fence, or tangible things that we can see for the energy and effort that we put in. Relationships, we don't. Unless we put a measure against them, they're intangible. So it's very easy to forget to prioritize them.
Without a doubt. So, Ali, for most families, communication isn't high on the agenda. You know, we don't talk about it. We don't have strategies in place. We haven't been practicing it over years. And so you imagine someone wakes up and they go, you know what, I want better communication with my mum and dad or with my kids. You know, the success of this family business is based on the success of our communication, but we don't really know where to start. How would you recommend someone in the family kick this off and have the conversation with the rest of the family around communication?
Yeah, that's a great question. For starters, I want to say that if you haven't been having these conversations and you go in to start them, it may feel like that first time you touch an electric fence. It may feel like a bit of a shock. So just, be okay, and be okay with not getting it right, and be okay with having that learner's hat on again. Because when you're going in to have conversations and to build that communication space, you might be 100% committed to it, but everyone around you might only be 60% committed or 30% committed. So it may not go as smoothly as you would like initially, but it's worth persisting with. So a great place to start is by setting up a communication plan, something formal, and we'll talk about informal in a second, but just having a space and a time where you come together and you discuss. And now, if you've never done this before, start with an agenda, have something written out so that everyone knows what to expect when they come in. They can be thinking about it before the meeting. When you get in there, you can actually be writing it out so that it's really structured, which takes away some of the anxiety and angst for people that might feel like, well, why are you calling me in now?
They don't feel ambushed.
Yeah. And if we haven't had a conversation for 20 years, what have I done wrong for this conversation to come up now? So you'd start with the very beginning and say something like, whatever it is, I listened to this podcast, or I've been reading, or my friends, or let's bring an expert in. But let's start with having a regular catch up to talk about these 5 things and just work out what are the key 5 areas that you need to have on the table. And it might be operations of the farm. It might be what's gone well, what hasn't gone well, what are we working on. It might be how are we going to scale the farm? Whatever it is for you and your family and that business right now, just choose 5 things or 3, but no more than that, and say, this is what we're going to look at. This meeting is allocated for this reason, and have it regular. Because what you do when you're having regular meetings is you're creating a space to have the difficult conversations when they come up, and you're creating patterns of behavior, and you're practicing it. It's like you're going in and having your football practice over and over again so that when game day comes, you know what to do. So by having these conversations often, you have a really solid platform to then navigate those challenges, or to say, let's talk about that in the meeting. Or, I've got something really big to talk about. Can I just pop it on the agenda and we'll all talk about it when we get to Sunday afternoon, whenever it is that you decide. So having a formal communication plan is definitely a great place to start. You can even narrow it down to having 5 specific questions, and you ask those same questions every time. If you do nothing else other than that, that's a great start. Then there's informal conversations. So that's, like what we call water cooler or breakfast chat. That's making sure that you're engaging with the person when you're in the room with them. So if you're walking past the fridge, ask a question. Sometimes that you're tired, you're busy, you've been out in the hot sun all day working, you get home and you just want a cold drink. Just spend 5 minutes asking the people in the room, how was your day? What have you got up to? Something not about you, about the other people, because you're building that foundation so that when you do come in the following day and you've had a really tough day and you need something from that person, you've actually got a foundation that you're working from. You're not just asking something of them without having had any communication with them the day before or the day before that. So formal and formal communication. The other big one is know your hats, personal and business. You don't bring the boardroom into the bedroom. So, that's one of the easy ways to think about it. You might be okay talking business all day long. You might be okay talking about the farm for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because it's your passion. You love to talk, a whole number of reasons. The other person, they may need a break from it, and that is okay. So just, again, having that conversation with your family and say, how do you go when we talk about business all the time? Or being aware enough to think, for the next half a day, I'm actually not going to talk business and I'm just going to talk to them about personal stuff, because it can get really blurred really quickly. And if you're not checking in with that person, they could get really frustrated or resent it without you even realizing that that's happening.
So, Ali, there's just a couple of points I'd like to make. Is the first one is I heard a psychologist out of Canada say this once. He said a fight ignored or an argument ignored is an argument magnified. I think it was, something like that. So in other words, every disagreement you ever have is, if you don't have it today, it's going to be magnified. It'll manifest into something bigger later. So you're better off to clean that out early and have the discussion when it's not a big weeping, gaping sore.
Yes. And what that does is it sets you up for success for next time. So you're creating that pattern that the person trusts that you will come in and have a conversation when there's a problem.
Yeah, perfect. And the second thing I'd like to make a comment on is, what is your why for doing this? What's your reason? You've got to have a really strong reason for doing this. And I see quite often in mums, it's about, I just want my family to get along. So they've got a really strong why for making this stuff work. For me, I look at it this way, if I was in the younger generation, is if I don't learn these habits now or improve these skills, and I'm having a difficult conversations with my mum and dad and they're frustrating me because they don't have good communication skills, that's going to manifest in me, and then I'm going to pass it on to my children. And 20, 30 years from now, you're going to be having that same conversation and the same reactions with your children. So learn the habits now to pass on something much better to them down the track.
And if you have someone in the family that's not a big chatter, say to them, when's a good time for us to chat? Set them up so that they know when it's coming and they can prep themselves for that. Someone that's really introverted, that doesn't like to talk just to make sound, may not see value in having lots and lots of conversations. But if you just pinpoint a time and say, we're going to have a chat about X at this time, then that gives them a chance to prep, get ready, know the conversation's coming. One thing that we haven't said, Ben, though, that's really important here is having the right conversations with the right person at the right time. We've spoken about the right time, but make sure you're having it with the right person. So it's okay to go and debrief or to talk to your spouse or to chat to your brother or sister about, God, I'm getting so frustrated about mum and dad and they're doing this, this and this, but you have to follow through with having the conversation with mum and dad. You need to make sure you're talking to the person where that conflict is happening.
Yeah, and what I see a lot of people make the mistake of, Ali, is they go and have the conversation with mum.
Yes.
Mum, dad's pissing me off. This is what's happened. Can you sort dad out? Or, they vent to mum over and over again and she's the poor, stuck between a rock and a hard place. Or dad comes home and says, that bloody daughter of yours or that son of yours has done this today, and then they're put in the middle. So I think that's a great point, is it's okay to vent, but make sure you have that conversation with the person you're having the issue with.
Yeah, and bring the people in. Like often it's someone that's married into the family that gets left out of the conversation. Why are we leaving them out? What damage is that going to do over the long time? Like, can we include them in the conversation, or a conversation that's important and relevant to them that gives them value as well? Because if you're only having a conversation with one person in the family that affects everyone in the family, then that's never going to end well.
And it's interesting. I was interviewing someone the other day around how to retain and attract and retain quality staff. And they said on all the exit interviews they've done with people that have left farming operations, it was around being heard, being appreciated and being heard. And so I'd say for the next generation coming through, if you're parents, is sometimes it's enough to be able to go out and say, hey, what's going on? Let me hear what the problem is. Can you articulate to me? And feeling heard and understood builds so much trust in a family, doesn't it?
Yeah, and that circles back to us saying you don't have to solve it in that moment. If you go into problem solver straight away, they may not feel validated and heard. So it's okay just to listen. It's okay to listen, go away and reflect and come back to the conversation again.
So Ali, just really quickly, because we're getting to the end of our time frame here, but everyone's different. Does that factor in?
Yeah, yep, absolutely. It's we often understand or have an intellectual understanding that people are different to us. But what often gets missed is that appreciation piece. So, someone might be really detailed focused and task driven, and we can see that they do it differently, but we don't appreciate the value they bring to the table by doing it differently. We just get frustrated at the fact that they're doing that way. And a really simple example is you ask your brother to take out the bins, and 2 days later the bins still aren't taken out, and you get frustrated at that. Why is he not taking out the bins? In his eyes, he might have 3 days to do it, and he's calculated it into his schedule, and he knows he's doing it Wednesday morning before he drives to town because he can pop it on the back of the ute and drive it up the driveway. That's a really simple example of where we're missing the appreciation piece, that he's actually really detailed, task focused, he's got it aligned. We're just getting frustrated that he's not doing it our way. And so if anyone's really interested in doing some more work around that, you can bring someone in to have a look at profiling, like personality profiles. Disc profiling's one, strength-based approach is another. Or another area is looking at the love languages. You can do a quiz online. So there's some of the things that we mentioned about not being scared to outsource. It's working out how valuable is this to you and who. It's the who question. Who do we have in our world, or who do we need in this scenario that can help us with this? Because we're not meant to be able to do it all ourselves. And anyone that thinks that they can, that's the person I'm most worried about.
The secret to success is who, not how, Ali.
Absolutely.
So before we wind up, Ali, is there anything else you'd like to add to the communication piece?
I guess just to pull it all together, this is a really complicated topic that we're talking about. You know, people spend weeks, months, years having conversations about this, and we're still learning and we're still processing. So talking about it in 45 minutes, if you just got one thing out of this podcast, then it's worth it. And one thing that we haven't said is, what are you hanging on to that no longer serves you? Or another way of saying that is, what can you let go of that's no longer serving you? Are you holding on to resentment, fear, frustrations? Are you standing at the kitchen sink having a conversation in your head about someone else on the property? They can't hear you. How much time and energy you're putting into being frustrated that you could be putting into nurturing and growing that relationship instead of growing the cracks within that relationship. So, you know, just if you're listening now, perhaps think about what's one thing I can do, what's one step that I can take that's going to move me one step closer to my goal.
Fantastic, Ali. Well, that's been absolutely amazing. There's been some great tips in there. I've written quite a few notes for myself. I know I'm always trying to improve my communication, and there's been some great things in there for me. Where can people find more about you online, Ali?
Probably if you head to Challenges That Change Us, we have a Facebook community that everyone's a part of with lots of tips and hacks, lots on communication, or listen to the podcast, Challenges That Change Us. And on LinkedIn, I'm just under Ali Flynn.
Perfect. Well, for anyone who's looking for a great podcast to listen to, I know oodles of farmers these days do, driving into town on the tractor, and I've even got some on the horse when they're out mustering. Ali's podcast is fantastic. It's going great. Gangbusters, I think is the right word to use, Ali. She loves it. She's good at it. She's a great communication expert and loves this space. So really thank you very much for being involved today. And before we wind up, Ali, I like to ask all my guests this question, and I'm always fascinated by the different responses. So what's your definition of true wealth?
Oh, honestly, I think it's knowing yourself and knowing what success looks like, but not success in performance, like success in your life. So for me, it's flexibility and freedom and having the ability to pivot. So as long as I can pivot where my family needs me to, you know, change my job, move, help them with their schooling, their homework, be available for my husband if he needs me, like that ability to have enough room in my life to free up space when someone needs me, or to do something I love and to have experiences, then that is true wealth for me.
That's the best one I think I've heard for a long time, Ali. That's a really different take on things. I like it. So having the ability to have a situation that you live in where you can actually move and pivot and deploy your resources, it'll give the best outcome for you and the family.
Yeah, just not being on a rat wheel and not feel like you're just doing the daily grind. Yeah, that's definitely true wealth for me.
Awesome. Well, look, thanks very much, Ali. If anyone wants to listen, as I said, to the podcast, get onto it. Challenges That Change Us. Thanks very much, Ali. And yeah, we'd look to forward to having you back on again at some stage to follow up on this topic, which I'm sure many, many people will be interested in.
Thank you so much, Ben.
Well, I don't know about you, but I got a whole lot of gold nuggets out of that conversation with Ali, and I've written a lot of notes. I'm sure you've done the same. Now, if you happen to know anyone that's having problems with communication, especially in a rural family, I'd love it if you could share the podcast with everyone you know or anyone in that situation, because we're all about trying to improve communication. If I just take you back to what I said early on in the episode, is about 60% of intergenerational wealth transfers or successions fail because of a lack of communication and trust. And so if we can improve this, this skill, which is communication, then we can have a big impact on the community. And so that's it for this week. I'll see you in 2 weeks' time.